Hey everybody. Just a reminder, Friday we're in the library. I put the room number up on our class website. And we're just going to kind of get you all started on, if you haven't already started research on your midterm paper, we'll get you started, basically. Talk it through, find you a couple good sources, that kind of thing. Today we're just going to keep on going. We've switched to the unit that is political geography. Talk a lot about states and, well, for this one, boundaries and borders. Anyone have any general questions before I just talk about this stuff? This chapter starts off with a couple different things. One of them being talking about kind of one of the most protected border areas of the world, and there's lots of these areas obviously, but after the Korean War, which was I think 1950 to 53, there was an agreement during the whole war. Actually, this boundary between sides didn't really change that much. It had slight ups and downs. And so there's been this kind of agreed upon border that is actually a kind of a large nature preserve at this point, just because no one does anything on this territory of land. There is an actual border wall, and there's little areas to cross for diplomatic things or whatever, but those are very well guarded. And the other areas are all really mined. There's lots of mines, so well, some of you would explode if you walked across there. So on the news now and then we do see people escape more from north, more than people are going from South Korea. Actually, I have a video I'll show you on North Korea, just to give you a better idea of what it's like. I'll probably show that on Monday. Oh, and the other map over here, well, it just shows you how relative things are, right? This is 15th century, and you can see Korea pretty similar to how it actually is, and then China somewhat, and then the further away you go, right, this is supposed to be Saudi Arabia, Africa, this is supposed to be Europe. It's all kind of not very distinguished because, well, it was far away, right? And it's still true today, even in our international age, the further away something is, kind of in general, the less people know about it. This whole unit is on political geography. Like I said, this chapter that we're doing today is going to be more on the state of political geography and analysis of power, right? A lot of geography is looking at power and power relations. Even in the chapters that were before here weren't necessarily political power. So states, right? Probably have something in your head. Obviously, we're not talking about a state like the U.S. has states, and thinking of more of the United States would be a state in this context. France is one of the classic ones that's often used, primarily because they've had pretty settled borders, relatively speaking. Sovereignty, right of the government to control and defend its territory and determine what happens within its borders. So that's a big part of, well, what's going on in a number of different conflicts around the world. One of them that has been on the news, but is in a little less these days, is in Ukraine, right? In Ukraine, so for example, well, Russia feels like it should be controlling and determining what goes on within those territories of Ukraine, even insisting that Ukraine itself is not a separate entity, which Ukraine disagrees with. Nation. And again, nations are actually relatively newish things in lots of ways. I know they seem to us to be very eternal and see these things that have been around forever. Nations often have a mindset of, an amount of unity culturally, we'll say it that way. Nation state, territory occupied by a group who view themselves as a nation and have politically recognized boundaries of a state they call their own. Right, Japan being an example. Japan's a good example because, again, well, it's been relatively stable for a long time, but also it being a large island, its borders are pretty easy to define, and that's another reason they haven't changed a lot through time. Even though Japan they had their own colonial period where they took over areas of the world, Japan itself has been pretty static. one of the areas of the world that gets a lot of attention, but is an actual very small part of the world, but it's in the news a lot today. Israel. Let's see. People watching this on the news? Not really. Current conflict. Anyone know anything about the current conflict? Well, all right. Well, in order to discuss the current conflict, I got to give you a bit of history. This is a lot of history to consume in a small amount of time. I always find that maps do a pretty good job of helping figure this out. So you can see I have a lot here. Let's see. I would say, well, I don't know why these have gotten like these little artifacts. There were good pictures when I copied them over. Well, anyway, so going back in time, of course, Jewish people have their origins before a large global diaspora to this region, where there was an ancient kingdom and whatnot. But there was also a diaspora moving around the world. Through time, although there was kind of a constant Jewish presence of some amount in this country, it wasn't, well, in this territory, I should say, it wasn't really until the end of Second World War and the Holocaust and many Jewish people being murdered in Europe that a lot of Jewish people decided to move out of Europe, right? And plenty moved to other places. Many moved to the U.S. Many moved to Israel because there was a feeling that if you're a minority in a country, there's always a chance that it could just kind of turn on you. That's what was kind of the general perception among the Jewish population. And so you had, well, who was in control of this area at the time, right? Who owned it? Who decided that Jewish people should have it? Well, as weird as it sounds, during colonialism, Britain took over this area, right? After the end of the Second World War, European powers mostly started giving up their colonies. When I say mostly, the geography is uneven. Some places gave away places earlier, some later. Well, the British just, they decolonized a lot of their places. In this place, they handed over to the Jewish population that was in Europe. So that population came on down. Now, there were people who were living here. Like I said, there were some Jewish populations who were living here, but there were a lot of people who we call Palestinians, right? You hear Palestinians in the news. Well, the locals, the Palestinians, what they saw was basically an invasion, right? They saw more colonization, right? Because to them it was Europeans who were all coming to this region and also kicking Palestinians out. Right, kicking Palestinians out. And so you have a case of Gaza's in the news a lot, right? This is because there's recent conflict right here. There's been a lot of conflict through the years, When this first became a state of Israel and the Palestinians were pushed off land, the neighboring countries that suddenly had thousands and thousands of Palestinians move into their territory, they went to war against Israel. They went to war, and there's lots of wars. In general, these wars did not last super long. Some of them were like a year or two. Some of them were like days long. As Israel developed, they really invested in military technology, and their military became quite a bit more powerful than neighboring countries, right? So for example, just to take one military conflict, well again, you had these neighboring countries at war. Well, Israel, just use an example of Egypt, Israel took this much territory during that military conflict. Egypt did pretty bad comparatively. If you've ever heard the term land for peace, well, what Israel did was, let's stick with Egypt as an example. Israel said, well, we will give you all this back, right? This big part of territory But you have to recognize our border, right, that you have said does not count as a country. You have to recognize this. And Egypt did. And this kind of thing happened a bit with different places. Again, like I said, these are large periods of time I'm talking about. Tough to summarize in a few minutes, but I'm doing my best. So these populations, Palestinians, were pushed to these margins. The areas that they were pushed to were not like especially good soil. They didn't have a lot of resources. And that's the area that the populations were pushed off to. So the current, let's talk about Gaza right now. Gaza is this strip of land here. There was a recent attack from Gaza into Israel. A lot of it was mostly civilians, and a lot of people, a lot of settlements were attacked. I don't remember what the total death count is at this point. And so then when that happened, it was done by a group called Hamas. Hamas is in control of Gaza. Now, this wasn't through like a political process. There wasn't an election. About 2006, there was military conflicts between different parties vying for control. And if you can imagine the political parties in the US, if they just like went to war with each other, Hamas basically won. This was 2006, and there hasn't been an election or anything. Politically, you can't speak out against Hamas. That's against the law. You'll be arrested or worse, right? So the Palestinian people, of which there's about 2 million, the amount of people who are in Hamas is, I think it's been, they've said it's between 20 to 40,000, right? So it's a small subsect of the population, but they control the area. After this attack happened, Israel declared war on Hamas. Now, this is the thing. If you're going to attack Gaza, when we're talking about populations and population pyramids, Gaza has a very pyramid-shaped population pyramid. So most of the population are under 15, right? More than half the population under 15. So the majority of the population are children. And what that means, if you're going to have a war, even if your enemy is Hamas, there's thousands of children who are going to die. That's just like a fact of war. There's always a lot of civilian deaths, right? Even in wars that, we're fighting the Nazis. Well, mostly it was not Nazis who died, right? It was mostly not Nazis. It was all civilians and people who were in Germany. Well, that's what's going down right now. And we also live in, the cell phone internet age. So there's a lot of documentation of all of this. All the deaths, people are recording, they're sharing on social media. A lot of people have called for a ceasefire, things like that. But we'll see what happens. Israel right now, their own government is very unpopular. Benjamin Netanyahu, a lot of different countries have lots of checks and balances to power of your president or your prime minister or whatever. In the US, like Congress and the courts are checks on presidential power. If we didn't have those, the president could just do whatever they wanted, right? In Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, he was working on basically getting rid of the courts. And this was very unpopular. And locally within Israel, most people consider this attack, of course, Hamas is the one who did it and they're to blame, but they also see this as a real big failure because their current political administration that's in power is very conservative and has ran for office on basically a law and order, protect our border kind of a ticket. But the border here between Gaza and Israel, it was actually pretty easily breached. They just had bulldozers and some explosives and they just knocked down the wall. It went pretty quick. What Benjamin Netanyahu had been doing for the past several years is he had been spending money on an underground border wall with Gaza, because in the past there was a tunnel that went through. And then people would attack who came out of the tunnel. Now, the amount of people that could go through a tunnel to attack a place versus if you just knocked down a whole bunch of wall, right? When the walls were knocked down here and Hamas came through, it was like 1,500 soldiers who just kind of came through and started shooting everybody. I think, well, actually, let me continue one more detail. Like I said, the local Palestinian population saw this as European invaders, right? Because the Jewish population were European, right? They're all from Europe, had been there generations. So after these wars happened, the border wasn't stabilized because you still have in the West Bank here that is primarily Palestinians. You have Israelis and Jewish people who are buying individual properties, right? And they are pushing out Palestinians still to this day. Like, it still happens, it's still ongoing. And so people see this as modern day colonialism, neocolonialism, right? A lot of Palestinians and then other people in the region who kind of see this happening. So that's why there's always tensions. There's always tensions because it's a continuous process that is still going. Some pictures of the various border walls there. Any questions about all that stuff? No, that's a lot. All right. And I talked about the refugees. All right, some different key terms. Multi-state nation, right? Consists of people who share a cultural or ethnic background but live in more than one country. These are very often diasporas. They use Korea as the example. Irredentism. This is on the news when they're talking about Ukraine and stuff. Irredentism is, well, as you can see, attempting to acquire territories in neighboring states inhabited by people of the same nation. What does that mean? Do I got a map somewhere? I don't, so I'll just talk it through. Well, Russia, right, during the Soviet era, it took over a lot of countries, and it moved Russian people into those countries into kind of nodes of power and control to tell those countries what to do. Now, when the Soviet Union fell, there's still large Russian populations in many countries, right? And, well, when Russia invaded Ukraine, people had assumed that it was going to take over the parts that are mostly Russian already, right? People were surprised because Russia actually went to take the whole country, went for the capital, but it annexed small parts back in 2014 that were mostly Russian, and those were just kind of let go. And I actually think, honestly, if Russia had just attempted to take parts of Ukraine that are majority Russian, probably the world would have kind of like shrugged. But attempting to take the whole place and then also murdering on a mass scale, that's why the war is ongoing and why the U.S. supports Ukraine in this conflict. Multinational state, country with various ethnicities and cultures living inside its borders. Classic examples, the U.S. of this. Stateless nations. Sometimes you might hear on the news about the Kurds in the Middle East, and there's no Kurdistan per se. The Kurdish population are actually split up among different countries, and the Kurdish people themselves are quite persecuted in these different countries because they're a pretty small minority. In some areas in Turkey where the Kurdish populations are good like oil resources and stuff, and so none of these countries wants a Kurdistan, but the Kurdish people want a Kurdistan because then they would have a country where they are the majority and they would have much more, they wouldn't be a persecuted minority anymore. Autonomous or semi-autonomous regions, region within countries that are given some authority to govern their own territories independently of the national government. Indigenous reservations in the U.S. is a good example. Greenland as well, partially because, well, Greenland is really far away from Denmark, right? And the economy and culture of Denmark just is not that connected, although technically they're still one country. But Greenland itself is allowed an amount of autonomy. Someday they'll probably split off from each other, but Greenland has not especially been wanting to do that yet. Like I said, stateless nations, a couple different maps, kind of showing the distribution. I'm not going to have you do an activity. This chapter also talks about how, well, as I've already said, very often when these textbooks talk about states and countries, they'll go to like the classic European countries, because again, they're kind of seen as these things that have been eternal or whatever, but they're really not. They're really not. The further back in time, the more fragmented these places are. And they used to be a whole bunch of city-states where you'd have all the kind of main cities in different European countries used to be their own kingdoms and their own culture, very often their own language. But as different empires kind of build and whatnot, those empires tended to kind of make everyone merge their culture together into one kind of unified thing. But these split-offs happen a lot. If you've heard the term balkanization, that is when countries kind of continue to split off because you'll have different groups, you have enough kind of diversity in their geographically different places that places will just kind of want to have their own identity and their own country, even if the countries themselves at that point start getting kind of smaller and smaller and smaller. France, like I said, being one of the examples of a country that's been around for a long time. Part of the reasoning is, well, because there are big land barriers, and in most European countries, to use those as examples, you know, if you look at the dividing line between Spain and France, well, there's mountains there, and you know, Italy has mountains blocking it, and so natural land barriers have tended through time to kind of keep a people together and kind of interacting more, so they have bit more of a unified culture, right? But France today, it was a city-state located in Paris that basically colonized these parts that were culturally different through time. And so today we see more of a unified kind of one common culture. But if you're on the ground in France and you travel around, you'll see lots of stark differences. A couple more definitions. Let's see, of these, I think choke point is kind of one of the more, one of the ones that we have some maps for. Shatter belts, there's lots of shatter belts around the world, places where you have lots of conflict, and so different powers are kind of moving back and forth. So choke points are usually resources. In the example from our book, oil resources, and oil tends to be shipped around, right? It wouldn't be economical to fly it around. And so, well, because it's in boats and it's shipping around, geographically, there's only so many different ways you can go, right? And so, you know, if you're shipping and someone cuts off one of your areas, like kind of famously a couple years ago, the Suez Canal was blocked. I don't think it was on purpose. I think it was just like a bad ship captain. And so that these choke points mean that you could also, if there's political things going on, so like the recent conflict in the Middle East, the countries involved don't really have any oil, but the price of oil has gone up because the region is seen as unstable, right? Even though it's not going to affect the flow of oil really at all. But that's what happens with choke points. People get worried if an area seems like it's going to be blocked, because often they are. Colonialism and neo-colonialism, you know, a couple terms are used quite a bit. Talked about colonialism before. Colonialism itself has been going on since basically the dawn of civilization. As soon as there was invented agriculture, there was a division of labor, and you had empires that sought to get resources from neighbors and expand their empires, right? This, of course, started on very small scales, but through time, each empire just kind of got bigger and bigger. Neocolonialism, which I don't know if we talked about a ton before, but neocolonialism is seen when outside larger state powers still have a lot of effect on other countries, where those countries should just kind of be allowed to do whatever they want, right? Map of Africa here from our book. So during colonialism, European powers in Africa sought to basically divide up strong groups that could be someday their own country, right? And so, for example, you have this region here that is one ethnicity and one language and one shared culture. But the European powers drew these borders, and these are, again, borders that we see modern day, and people often just think, oh, these are just countries that have existed forever in these shapes, and that's not the case. That's not the case. All these other littler shapes would be the shapes if all these were nation states in the way we know them. This is one of the reasons why there's so much internal conflict as well, is because you have different ethnicities, languages, and cultural norms, and religions, and all kinds of different things, and old hostilities that still kind of come back. Even though, as you can see, the countries of Africa largely got their independence mostly after World War II, mostly but not totally. I'm not going to do a knowledge check. Another term that you might just hear kind of sometimes, self-determination, right, about people to choose their own political status. Not all countries feel that this is an important thing. In general, the US does, in general. So legacies of colonialism and imperialism. There's lots of these things that are across the landscape, right? So like when we're looking at languages, Spain and Portugal, Britain, these are countries that, well, the legacy of their cultures still are in places that used to be colonies, right? So obviously, right now I'm using English. It's because it was originally a British colony, right? And that was the language that became the standard, even though you had people mostly migrating from not Britain to the US. Modern day US today is mostly not British people, but you still have the legacy of that, right? Religions around the world also are usually brought about through colonialism. Devolution, when a central power of a state is broken up among regional authorities within its borders. That's basically what happened to the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union fell. You had a bunch of countries that were forced to be one country for a long time, and then when the Soviet Union fell, they sought their own independent movements pretty rapidly. And Russia itself had lost so much power and control that it really couldn't do anything to stop that. But it's only more recently that they've been trying to basically strong-arm their way into the politics of neighboring countries. Belarus is an example where people call it a bit of a puppet state because it will kind of do whatever Russia wants it to do. Ukraine has been that in the past, and when Ukraine politically wanted to be more aligned with the West, that is when Putin started invading. Because there's a lot of resources in Ukraine. Russia, as a kind of neo-colonial thing, Russia still wants those resources to basically go through Russia. But Ukraine found that its resources, food and different things, people elsewhere in the world wanted to pay more money for it because they're valuable commodities rather than basically have Russia take these resources for free or near free. Let's see, I'm not going to talk about every type of political border. I think I'm going to talk about, our book talks about the Berlin Wall and, well, the border between what had been communism and the free West for many years. This is actually going across the border. They used to be highly militarized. Anyone been to Germany and done the wall walk? Maybe, maybe not. Well, this is of course an area that was a highly militarized border. At the end of the Second World War, Germany was split up and the Soviet Union got a piece of it, and the West collectively got kind of a larger piece. And when this happened, as the Soviets took control of one part of Germany, well, after the Second World War, there's a thing called the Marshall Plan, where the US basically said, you know what, after the First World War, they made Germans poor by making them pay payments for having lost the war. What if instead we just give them money to rebuild and we just kind of like encourage them to be democratic, and what if we go a completely different route so that there won't be a World War III? Russia did the opposite. The area of Germany it took over, it charged people a big tax for basically having lost the war, and left East Germany very poor through time as Western Germany developed and got a really good economy and whatnot. Well, when Russia fell, the countries were able to unify. So now this area that had been a very fortified wall is now just a giant historical monument. In areas where the wall's been taken down, they still have markings along where it was. And they also put up different kind of historical things of note in different years. Some parts of the wall are still there. And you can see yet more areas where they have different types of boundaries where the wall used to be. As you walk along the wall, they have, like I said, different historical moments. Eastern German Guard ran for it to come to the West, 1961. Through time, that happened less and less as the wall became more and more fortified. Russia didn't want to lose those populations, but as I said, they were quite persecuted, so plenty of people in East Germany, if they were able to leave, they did. In Berlin, there's not a lot of old buildings anymore because, well, much of Germany was flattened during the Second World War, so they have some here and there. This is a Holocaust memorial in Berlin, and it's along the walk. I'm going to show you a little bit about, well, this is a museum on when Russia had control of the Czech Republic, right? It was Eastern Europe. Well, what did they do when they had power and control of this region? This is a good museum, but basically they occupied, right? They came in and they took over. The Soviet Union really wanted to extract resources from the places that took over, so it was pretty classic colonization, even though at the time they called themselves like a big collective communist, like workers' paradise. But a lot of that was propaganda, especially if you weren't living in the area around Moscow, basically. They're the ones who economically benefited from the growth of this empire. So in these countries that were taken over, when we talk about colonization, this is like a typical apartment of the era. This is a police questioning room that they've, as you see, have put on the side just to kind of show how skewed things were. All these different countries had secret police, right? And they could do whatever they want with impunity. They could arrest you if you'd said something bad or just for whatever reason, right? These are the things that the places that had been basically colonized by Russia did. And also, similar to other colonization, they made everyone in these countries learn Russian, right? They told everyone to adopt Russian culture, to start doing Russian things, basically. And this is also another classic kind of colonization thing, where you have boarding schools that you force kids to go to. In the US and Canada, there were schools that indigenous populations' children were forced to go to, kind of famous boarding schools. In many of these different countries, there were revolutions that would rise up and they would be put down again and again. Basically, people would be shot if they tried to rise up. It wasn't until the Soviet Union fell that they were actually able to get their freedom. But I would say this museum is an example of when Ukraine was invaded, all the neighboring countries started sending supplies and armaments and whatnot, because all of the neighboring countries had been invaded and taken over by Russia before. And so there's a strong local unity about not allowing Russia to do that, because they've all gone through this process historically. All right. That can't be doing. Boundaries between different places. Well, I don't think I'm going to go through every definition of a boundary. I will say another thing that's talked about in this chapter is the boundary of the Great Wall of China. That's usually used as kind of the big example of a border. Anyone been to China? Great Wall? Not yet? Let's see. This is a picture, of course, people talk about it being viewable from space, right? This big, large border. When I went to China, I went to the Great Wall, so I'll just show you a little walk of what that wall is like. This is a place where we stayed that was near the wall. The wall is not too far from Beijing. Very kind of folk, traditional architecture. Although when we went to bed, they made the women and the men sleep separately, because this is a bit of a rural area and they're a bit old-fashioned. And then the women in their side were locked in, which they did not know that they had to use a bathroom for a final time before being locked in. And so there was a bad time that was had. So we had a group of mostly Australians walking with us. When we went to the wall, there was a lot of like rides and things that had been put in place. I think China felt that this would be a popular, maybe amusement park thing. These are actually just little cars on little things that just go up and down. But when I was there was no one on any of the rides. Bumper cars and things like that. It's like no one really. If people go here, they're going to the wall. All right, so we're walking up to the wall. In general, the sky and atmosphere will look maybe a little murky. That's not just like fog or anything. That is the air quality. When I went, it was before the 2008 Olympics, and they didn't clean the air until then, and that was usually just the area around Beijing. And people described it as like smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. I'm not a big smoker, but it was tough to breathe. So this is the wall itself. The area around the wall is called Inner Mongolia, and it's like, well, what does that mean? Well, that just means it's actually the part of Mongolia that China took, right? And so the population there are Mongolian, but it's within China. Our guide here is Mongolian. One interesting thing about the wall is that obviously we all think of it as a border and as this barrier that like is kind of, you can't penetrate it. But in ancient times, although it was for protection, it's actually the only paved surface in the area. And so whoever had control of this wall also had control of quick communication along it, because it was, I know you can only, from certain angles like this, you could see that this is a path. This is basically a large walking path. So to me, it's as much of a road as it is a wall. Oh, but also I should say, so the area that tourists go to of the wall has been largely reconstructed because it did not last. Walls are actually physically pretty easy to tear down in general. And so these areas have been reconstructed. They were like smashed up and whatnot. And to see the areas that are kind of like in their natural state of how they would be, you have to hike out for hours and hours. which we did. So I'll eventually show you those parts of the wall. As you can see, some areas are really steep. Oh, and I should also say that I don't know if I've talked about like tourist traps and stuff like that very much, or like aggressive sales and traveling to countries or whatnot. Different countries have their kind of different temperaments. So when I went to Egypt, for example, people were very aggressive at sales. Like if you're walking down a mall, someone will be like, "Oh, hey, how are you doing?" and shake your hand, and they'll pull you into their shop. Like people are really pushy. And some people are fine with that. I would say that there's a certain type of Minnesota shopping sensibility that I would describe as, when it comes to the cultural geography of Minnesotans, if they're at a store, they don't want someone to bother them like at all, really, right? If someone bothers a Minnesotan in a store, usually they're like, "I don't want any of your stuff, I'm going." But at the same time, Minnesotans still want someone who is attentive. And so if a Minnesotan is in a store and they have a question about something and there's no one there to answer their question, they may be like, "I give up, I'm leaving," right? Minnesotans are kind of fickle. The Chinese population kind of were perfect for a Minnesotan because, well, as we're walking and whatnot, the Chinese people who are with us, they're not other tourists, they're actually locals. And when we're walking, I actually asked my guide, I was like, "Oh, are these other tourists or what's going on?" He said, "No, these are locals." I'm like, "Oh, they just like to hang out or what?" He's like, "No, they want to sell you stuff." And I was kind of like, "Well, they haven't mentioned anything." And he's like, "Oh yeah, they will." So as we're walking and we're hiking, and this goes on for hours, after a while, you would have someone who'd like hold up water. And he's like, "You want some ice cold water?" And I'd be like, "No, I brought my own water. I have snacks. I'm fine. I'm all set." After another couple hours, they're like, "Yeah, ice cold." And then you're like, "Well, how much?" And they're like, 10 cents. Like, okay, I could spend 10 cents on a water. And then they'd be like, "You want a sandwich?" Very not pushy, so that we ended up buying basically everything they had. They had books, they had hats. We ended up kind of buying most of it because they were very not pushy, and took some photos with them. This is our guide, played with the kids. Like this hat, I think someone bought her hat off of her head. Oh, and this is getting out to the area that has not been rebuilt, right? We're hiking further and further out. Like I said, the air was real thick with pollution. Like I said, you got to hike for hours. Some unmanned stations that were here and there. All right, so this is when you get further out to the area that has not been rebuilt. There's still plenty of wall there for the most part, but obviously nature is like kind of come back. And also, oh, that's a lizard, which is the only wildlife I saw while I was out there. But you have to remember that this wall fell. The Mongolian army came across many times. And so much of the wall is kind of like this, just kind of like deteriorated and falling apart. Lots of areas that we had to kind of walk around. You might notice some of the locals kind of holding someone's hand as they get through, because there's some areas that will fall if you walk along them. And that's the end of the Great Wall of China. Yeah.
Did you have to hike all the way back?
What's that?
Did you have to hike all the way back?
No, we took a vehicle. We took a vehicle at the other end, because yeah, that would have been a nightmare. That's true. Well, let's see here. We're near our summary. I've got enough time for y'all to think of some questions. All right, I'm going to come out and do the card thing. Some questions, hopefully, get you thinking about geography. Actually, stop this recording.